Hello, everyone. It's Kate Stillman with the Yoga Healer podcast, and I'm here with Dr. Emeran Meyer, who's a distinguished research professor in the Department of Medicine at UCLA. And the reason that we're talking is your book on gut immune connection and all the research I've been doing in wild habits. And we happen to have a friend in common who was like, I could maybe help you talk to this guy who knows everything about what you're trying to understand. So it's really an honor and a pleasure to be able to be with you and ask you some questions. What I would love to know, like, first of all, is, the more I've done research on microbiome and immune system, I've sort of come to the conclusion that the strength of your microbiome determines the strength of your immune system and your immune resistance. And I would love to hear, what you think of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's at least two areas that are of relevance to this question. So one is what happens early on in life. I mean, the interactions of our immune system with microbes, both with what's called pathobionts or pathogens, and with commensals, which are the good guys. That this early interaction shapes really or programs the immune system in certain ways. So the the fact that today we see this increasing prevalence of autoimmune diseases and allergies and food sensitivities, a lot of people think has a lot to do with that altered interaction that we have as infants in a much more sterile environment, where we have banned microbes from, from the time of delivery, so C-sections and sterile hospital environments, to antibiotics early on, prematurely born babies ending up in intensive care units, being loaded with antibiotics for weeks sometimes. So that's one thing. And this is probably responsible manifests as this sort of surprising rise in all these diseases that when I went to medical school didn't even exist, like peanut allergies or other food allergies. The second one is, as an adult, this is obviously a dynamic system. I mean, the microbes adapt fairly rapidly to new circumstances. I mean, it's not a coincidence that they have hundreds of millions of genes, several fold more, orders of magnitude more than we have human genes, and that allows them to adapt much more rapidly to new situations. So since the microbes live in such close proximity to the biggest part of our immune system, which is located in the gut, about 70% of our immune cells are in the gut, either temporarily traveling through or permanently. So the microbes adapt to environmental factors rapidly, and that adaptation then is handed down to the immune system. And there's several ways that this can happen. One mechanism that has received a lot of attention is this leaky gut phenomenon.
Yeah.
That the separation, the mucus layer that separates the microbes from these immune cells sensors, these dendritic cells, gets compromised because we don't have the microbes that produce it anymore because of dietary factors or chronic stress. And so that's the second one. So one is in early life, and the second one is later in life. The first one is these autoimmune allergy type of diseases. The later one is a major risk factor for developing this current chronic disease epidemic that we're in with, anything from chronic brain disorders, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, to depression, chronic liver disease, cancer. Like, all these diseases basically have one thing in common, that there's an altered interaction between the food, the microbes, the immune system, and then that spreads beyond the gut. So nothing that happens in the gut stays in the gut. It's always, even like with COVID-19 vulnerability for long-term complications. COVID doesn't infect the gut primarily, but the gut immune system plays a big role in how the lungs respond, the immune cells in the lungs respond to that virus.
So I just want to summarize what you said, because to me, this is really important that we get, like, especially because a lot of people listening are, they have kids or they have grandkids or they're going to have kids. And if we can understand that first part of what you said around what happens early in life in terms of the natural exposure Homo sapiens have had to their environment, including going through the birth canal and picking up some of the good bacteria in the birth canal, which helps start to build the baby immune system, and even like upon ejection, right, from the mom's body, to then what we do. And if we look back historically, like there was a lot of skin to skin contact historically with newborns. There was a lot of mixing of the environment with the infant, and that helped create a baseline immune system, an innate immune system that was stronger. And that in the past, if we look at the last whenever we started sterilizing the birth environment and using pharmaceuticals earlier on, close to when the baby's born, antibiotics. I'm curious too, this kind of vaccines too, because I've read some studies on how vaccines, it's like a really good idea to use probiotics with vaccines because they're so hard on the microbiome.
That I cannot really confirm. I'm not an expert on that question. We had discussions with a very prominent scientist in this space, Rob Knight at UCSD. This question came up, and he vehemently rejected that idea that there's anything negative. And I know this is a big discussion right now, very politically polarized.
I just read an article on it with COVID and the elderly, and it was an Indian scientist who was showing the decrease in gut microbiome health with vaccines, and he was basically saying, like, please give people probiotics, post vaccination.
It's controversial. I would say the science is not there. Even with antibiotics, there was a study from a very prominent group from the Weizmann Institute in Tel Aviv.
Yeah.
It showed taking probiotics after, a cocktail of probiotics after antibiotic treatment, in many people delayed actually the recolonization with the patient's original microbiome. And there's inter-individual differences. So in some people, these probiotics, 24 hours after you take the last dose, they're gone. They're not allowed to settle. In other people, they actually stay, and then may actually make it harder for your own microbiome to come back. So I would say there needs to be
that's interesting.
There needs to be a lot more work on this, and there's this is not often mentioned by probiotic manufacturers. There's other science that says, eating a diet high in fermented foods. So this is not only increases the abundance of microbes in your gut that were in these foods, but they also allow other microbes from the environment to settle there. So you eat fermented foods that has lactobacilli, bifidobacteria. It's not only that those will now increase in your feces, but they also facilitate the entry of other microbes. So it's this is a wide open field. Because
that's where in all the research that I've done, where I keep landing is homemade small batch fermented foods. Like, forget the probiotics. Right. It's like, and this is part of like the word culture, right? Like the word culture and food culture, it's not a coincidence, right? That and so when I find with like the return to making those small batch homemade is you can really tailor it to your ecosystem and tailor it to your personal health and personal tastes, and that there's an intelligence loop happening there, where it's not in many ways, it's not productized. It exits consumerism and goes, because it's really inexpensive to make your own fermented foods, right? It's like ridiculously inexpensive to buy a head of cabbage and a couple tablespoons of salt and get rolling.
And so
Okay.
Koreans do it or have done it forever to make their own kimchi. And um, yeah, there's many other cultures. And it's interesting that, fermentation of food initially developed really to make it last longer,
Yeah.
um, not for any medical reasons. And
But
then
that's
I
not
think,
true in Ayurveda. So
oh,
in Ayurveda, they would use it for digestion, absorption, elimination, immune. And it's a huge, I mean, this is the thing, right? Like when we look in any indigenous culture, usually there's some relationship with a specific type of traditional fermented foods. And so in Ayurvedic medicine, it was always considered to pacify vata, which is the wind force, which creates the issues primarily in the nervous system first, and then the digestive system second. And it's like the nerves that upset the digestive system, like just the being nervous, being anxious, being worried. More of the people that are on the lighter side have less consistency with digestive capacity. And so for them, fermented foods was always it was at the point of being medicinal. It was like, this has got to be part of your daily diet to strengthen your microbiome. And so the book you wrote before Gut Immune Connection was on mind, and the whole connection with mind. So how did, I'm just really curious, like and just to backtrack. So the two parts you said before was like this, building this innate immune system strong from birth. And then what happens in adulthood if we have the habits of chronic inflammation, if we have the habits that lead to leaky gut. I have heard that right now about 1 in 3 people that are on standard American diet have leaky gut or have SIBO or have this issue of what you were talking about, where they're eating food and there's an absorption issue where we're not getting complete as digestion process in the digestive system, and it's going into the bloodstream and it's creating an immune reaction.
yeah, I mean, I would say, just to expand this a little bit. So when I give talks to American audiences, I look in the audience, and I usually can tell easily that 1/3 to half of the audience is overweight or obese, and the majority of these people will also have what we call metabolic syndrome, so which is related to this increased gut permeability and increased immune system activation. And it's important to remember, the immune activation happens in the gut. So these microbes are only microns away from immune cells, and they're only separated not even from a real barrier, a physical barrier, but by this mucus layer, which is produced by some cells in the gut, in the colon. And so the margin for error is pretty small. If you change that mucus layer just a little bit, you will already get contact between microbes and these immune sensors. And initially, it's probably just a localized reaction. So if you take a biopsy of these, so I remember before the microbiome became so popular as a science, people took biopsies during a colonoscopy, and it would say there's low-grade immune activation in these biopsies, and that's normal. Well, it wasn't really normal. It was picking up this low-grade immune activation in people that didn't have GI problems or GI cancer, but that already had that increased risk. The gut should not be inflamed in a small amount.
And would they have any symptomology like gas, bloating, nothing? No correlation.
Not necessarily. And and also the other way around. I mean, not everybody who has IBS type symptoms, has necessarily a leaky gut. It's not, they're not like one-to-one. And there are somehow different mechanisms. I personally believe that the majority of people that have IBS or the bloating do not have this low-grade systemic immune activation, or what's called metabolic endotoxemia, because these symptoms have not increased in the last 75 years, as some of these other diseases have increased, like the inflammatory ones, the colon cancer, the fatty liver, the heart disease, like all these have almost like exponentially increased. Irritable bowel syndrome has been fairly stable in its prevalence, which is interesting. So it's a different kind of disorder, I think. In my opinion, and we can argue about this, more driven really top down by the brain, stress, emotion, negative emotions. And that has recently been confirmed in a huge study where they looked at genetics and found that there's this that the genes that are more prevalent in patients with irritable bowel syndrome are related to anxiety and so basically to psychological problems. So this was done in 30,000 people. They analyzed this, So I think these functional disorders are more like a top-down disorder in the brain-gut microbiome system. All the food-related and microbiome-related are really a bottom-up phenomenon. It's always bi-directional. There's no linearity in the system, but it's
it tracks with Ayurveda, though, what you just said, with the the Vata types who have a much high, like irritable bowel is much more likely in a Vata type constitution, and again, it's like nerve to immune rather than digestive to immune.
It's so interesting, the whole Ayurvedic. I mean, I'm certainly not an expert on it, but we organized a symposium, an interdisciplinary symposium, I think it's now 20 years ago, in Sedona. And we called it the science and practice of mind-body interactions. And we had all the who is who in neuroscience there, and we had a practitioner in Ayurvedic medicine, a Native American healer. It was remarkable, today nobody finds this particularly unusual, but at the time it was really revolutionary. And so there were lots of discussions between and I actually forgot his name, the Ayurvedic practitioner and the neuroscientists there. Then we invited another Ayurvedic practitioner to UCLA and we had an evaluation of a given patient by a Native American healer, an Ayurvedic healer, and a traditional Chinese medicine practitioner.
Yeah.
It was fascinating to see, and what always has amazed me by which way these ancient practitioners had gained these insights, that now today we're kind of confirming with science. So there's got to be some other way, maybe hundreds of, centuries of observation that have led them to these insights. But it's remarkable, both for traditional Chinese medicine and for Ayurvedic medicine. That many of these concepts were already known, and put into place.
Yeah.
Fecal microbial transplants, or the high colonics. I mean, that has sort of fascinated me the most. That something like this became known thousands of years ago. It
really speaks to that there's so many ways of knowing. In cognitive function is one, but there's so many ways of knowing and sensing, and how much of our perspective and our beliefs influence how we think and how we solve problems. And that if we change, if we're in a different system of perspective and belief, there's other ways of knowing that we then can connect, often on an intuitive, tapping into intuitive intelligence and other forms. But let's get back to, I'm so curious about how you have felt and what you have been thinking about with the media and I'm not even sure how to say it, but it's like somewhere around like the media, the government response, the messages that typical people who suffer from chronic systemic inflammation, the messages they've been getting about COVID-19 and about what they can do to help themselves.
Well, I don't think the link, between lifestyle, diet, microbiome, um, immune system, and COVID-19 vulnerability has not been at the center stage of the discussion. It's all been about the vaccination and protecting against the fifth wave now, and we see it in Europe. That it's all all reactive. There's no sort of prophylactic thinking forward. Is something like this, is it ever going to go away? Are there going to be more pandemics like this? Which I would say yes, most likely. And why is that? So this idea that and hopefully this will become more a focus of discussion and also research. It's been pretty obvious that people that, unfortunately, it's associated with a lower socioeconomic status, unhealthier diet, greater prevalence of these non-infectious metabolic diseases. This group of individuals of the population had both a greater risk of developing COVID-19, having more severe courses, and most likely now also have a greater likelihood of developing the long COVID, which is another, horrible thing on the horizon. If millions of people develop this syndrome, so there's clearly this connection. And how can people protect themselves against it? I mean, number one, protecting yourself against COVID. I mean, the easy thing that being recommended, clearly paying attention in crowded spaces, the face masks, and I mean, this is all become almost like common knowledge.
Yeah, but I'm wondering more about like if say from what I'm hearing and reading, right, it's like chronic systemic inflammation. There's a direct correlation between chronic systemic inflammation and the severity of symptoms and chance of dying and then the long-term COVID symptoms, right?
And that is, and that is because like almost all the immune cells go through the gut and are influenced by events that happen in the gut, and then they go spread out throughout the body, including going to the lungs or going to the brain. So the reactivity, and the thing with COVID-19, it's the worst forms are this what's been called a cytokine storm, this hyper reactivity of the immune system. People always talk about we need to boost our immune system. With COVID-19, it's actually the opposite. It's you want to prevent this excessive response, and the excessive response happens because the immune cells are programmed in a non-adaptive way in their passage through the gut by these events that happen in the gut. Like the increased permeability and the dietary influences. So this opens up the possibility that through dietary interventions, but also through, I mean, the brain-gut microbiome system, I always like to emphasize this, is this bidirectional system where all players are constantly in contact with each other. It's not, and both the brain influence of the mind on the gut and the gut microbiome, they're equally important as the dietary influences. So the immune system ultimately is influenced by both of those influences. So negative emotions, like anger, like stress,
or fear,
they all have contribute to, and if you have the worst case scenario that you are on an unhealthy diet and you're constantly stressed, chronically stressed and anxious and angry and afraid, that's the worst case scenario. And I believe that many people that are most affected by this have that worst case scenario, and I mean, if you live, if you're chronically discriminated racially or perceive that, plus have struggle with the basics of life, income, housing, then you live under a chronically activated stress system, which will affect your microbiome and your gut permeability. And then you add the negative diet, the unhealthy diet to it, and so it's no coincidence when we look at. I always say this. So living on the west side of Los Angeles, with very few friends, maybe one or two that were affected by COVID-19. Life goes on almost like normal here.
Yeah.
It has been. But then you go to other places, look at other places, and it's disastrous. Even just like an hour or half an hour away. If you look at the ICU at UCLA hospital in an affluent area, and compare this to the county hospital, which is just half an hour to the east, the ICUs are overwhelmed. They can't deal with all the patients. So it clearly points to something that, as a society, I think we need to pay attention to, because as I said, the next pandemic will come for sure. I don't see people dramatically changing their lifestyles or their diet or their.
Well, statistically, it's gotten worse. So depression's higher, weight gain's higher, like all right. Diseases of chronic systemic inflammation have gone up in COVID. Like we don't have, and if we look at with the media and the messaging, it's been very fear driven, very victim driven, very much like you need a drug to save you. Yeah. And that seems really, to me, it seems insanely inconsistent with the science. And the science to me is showing that like what people actually need to see, if we actually cared about people, right? Whether we were in government or whether we're in media, it's like, or whether we're in pharmaceuticals, it's like, if we actually cared about people, we'd send them the messages that like, hey, there's all these great things you can do for yourself to protect yourself from COVID. And like, if you're overweight, you should lose the weight. Here's how. We know intermittent fasting works. If you're, like, we could send positive messages, right? That reaffirm empowerment and reaffirm people having a choice about how their day goes, and just around exercise, around circadian rhythm, around eating fermented foods, like the things that we know work for everybody and are accessible across socioeconomic classes.
And the link between all these things that you said, which I expanded on from the scientific standpoint in my second book. They're not.
Wait, let me pitch your book. Hold on to that idea. Gut immune connection, Emeran, Meyer, UCLA. Okay, go ahead, Emeran.
So yeah, all the things that you summarized, even though you haven't read the whole book, I'm sure you're very familiar with that whole space. This has not become the priority or the messaging right now. Everything is this sort of contingency, emergency, reactive messaging, and which just keeps enhancing the fear and the anxiety and the that it's not up to me to actually prevent this from happening, but it's up to the new medications that are now being developed. This is obviously a boon for the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, I don't want to say anything negative, because the development of these vaccines has been historical. Something like this has never happened in science. But at the same time, this is sort of something that creates billions of profits for the pharmaceutical industry, not just the vaccines, but now the medications that are being developed. And I think in the long term, yes, in the long term, we'll probably have to live like this, like with the flu. I mean, we may get a booster shot every year going forward, but that won't protect us for another viral pandemic.
So let's talk about this too, because let's talk about where humans' awareness of bacteria was in, say, like the 1950s compared to now. Like now we have like a lot of people who are somewhat educated they have the word microbiome in their vocabulary. I'll give them that. Microbiome's now in their vocabulary. Good bacteria, which is, is maybe as scientific as a lot of people will go, like that's now in the vocabulary. Let's talk about viruses too, and the virome, because I find most people haven't heard of the virome and don't understand the human body's ability to actually, the requirement of the virome to feed the microbiome and the interaction between viruses and bacteria, and just how humans and other mammals have evolved with both bacteria and viruses and the other components of the microbiome, and how, because of that, the word virus can be used in a way that invokes fear instead of a way that invokes a understanding of, wait, no, like viruses are part of this. I'm designed to adapt to the viruses and bacteria that are arising around me in my environment, because that's how humans have always adapted. So I'd love to hear your take on any of that.
Yeah, so this is clearly, even the term virome has not become popularized like microbiome. And 1 second. And there's not as much research going on in this area, but some of the findings that are coming out are really fascinating. So for a while it was thought that the viruses, I mean, first of all, it's fascinating to think about that that viruses, which we always associate with something bad and infections, you know, the cold and flu, and that they live inside of us in harmony, in symbiosis with us, just as the microbes do, and just as the fungi do. You know, it's really interesting. All these guys that we demonized for so much time are living there. So now, then there was an interim phase where it was thought that the viruses in the gut are mainly phages. So phages kill bacteria and basically inject their genetic material into you know, bacteria. And it was thought for a while that about 10%, there's a turnover, about 10% of microbes that are killed by viruses every day. The latest information that I've heard is actually an emerging knowledge of the symbiosis between viruses and bacteria. That, for example, certain viruses have adapted a symbiotic relationship with a particular bacteria. So and that means if you do a transplant, or if you culture a particular microbe that is good for you in a culture dish, and then transplant this into you know, an animal gut or a human gut, if it doesn't come with its viral friend, it doesn't do the same thing. So the viruses stimulate, without killing the bacteria, they stimulate its gene expression, its function. So it's really, I think we may be moving in a direction that what's good for us is to have these dyads between viruses and microbes that have evolved to make the microbes produce exactly the right kind of things for us. So I mean, the field is going to get a lot more complicated. I mean, I always feel we're just scratching on the surface of this science, you know, and it's sort of like the exploration of outer space. You know, we're getting closer, we're seeing amazing things, but we're far from really understanding it. And then also how this system inside of us connects to the world around us. I mean, it's clearly a major link that we have with our environment and with the microorganisms that are the dominant life form on this planet, you know, and probably on other planets as well, you know. So it's yeah, it's a fascinating thing. And you know, you have to be careful in terms of coming to practical solutions and recommendations. So there's this pseudoscience out there that that raises fears and promotes interventions that are based on a paper that came out that somebody just picks up from a mouse study and then say, oh, now we know everything about this. And as a scientist and eternal skeptic, you know, I've been very careful in doing this. On the other side, from a personal standpoint, I've always been fascinated by these ancient healing traditions, and sometimes I trust more.
You got married by a Tibetan monk in a temple, and I mean, yeah. So it's like you're not the typical
Yeah, and
Doctor, professor, scientist looking at microbes in a microscope.
yeah, and so what I feel, science shows the cutting edge of what we have the evidence for, the scientific evidence.
Hmm.
Then we have this empirical evidence. If something stays around for thousands of years and has helped people, we don't know the mechanism exactly, and some of these mechanisms that Ayurveda or
Hmm.
Chinese medicine has come up with to explain their findings are probably not accurate because they couldn't know this. But the empiric evidence that some of these things work and
Yeah.
are connected, that to me is a very important component of what I believe in. Both the science and also this empiric data.
I mean, just that, the holistic systems, right? The holistic medicine systems that are looking at the whole rather than the reductionism of the parts, right? There's these concepts, and to me, it's like there's a level where they're biological, and there's a level where they're spiritual, and the reflection of the microcosm and the macrocosm, or the microbiome and the macrobiome, and the different, the different, I would say, like grandmother wisdom that gets handed down, like this idea of like, if you're not grounded, get your hands in the dirt. And then we study the dirt and we're like, oh my gosh, the dirt's full of microbiomes. Now you're more adapted to your ecosystem, which means you're less allergic to your ecosystem, and all these things. Like, I feel like science moves so slowly in certain ways because it has to get money to study things very, very specifically in a sterile environment, in a controlled environment. And it's just so not how life works. And I feel like the holistic sciences, the holistic medicines have the advantage of understanding that it's not just the genome, it's the epigenome, right? It's not just your genetics, it's the epigenetic environment, including all the genetic material of your microbes and your viruses, your bacteria, that enable your gene to express themselves in the best possible way. That there's this understanding of very, very deep connectivity going into systems. It's all systems. And it sounds like even in the gut, like your deep dive into like, okay, there's the gut and there's the brain, right? And who's sending who messages, like who's calling the shots here, right? And you're saying like it's going both ways. It's going both ways. You have negative emotions, that's going to affect how your microbes in your gut are able to absorb your nutrition, and how your immune system is going to be able to get what it needs to do its job. And if we mess with that, because we're under stress all the time, we're not orienting towards circadian rhythm, we're not oriented towards positive messaging, or getting news alerts on our phone every 10 minutes that are showing us a negative environment, that's going to kill our mind. And so it's like we're not even thinking of the whole mind-body system yet in relationship to itself, let alone relationship to our social groups, let alone our relationship to our environment, all of which is like the bigger system in which the human being immune system is arising.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't say it any better. Like what you just said. I mean, so systems biology and network science, that's the way that we're going. There's no question. And the reason that we now find some of these stunning similarities between ancient concepts and modern sciences has exactly to do with that thing that we're discovering in science, systems biology and network science. And so initially it was individual genes, now it's the genome, the interaction of gene networks. It's not, we're still talking about certain bad bacteria. It's not the individual bacteria, it's the network, it's the microbiome, how they interact with each other. So whenever you add this om at the end, you realize that reductionistic science is just not providing the answers, it's the networks. And we've developed mathematical tools to understand, quantify the network connections. So there's now, we define a network by its nodes and by its hubs and by its edges by which they're connected. And these networks are scalable, so you can go from a genome network or a microbiome network and then that connects to brain and gut, but it goes way beyond that. It goes then to the soil microbiome and the environmental microbiome, and I think I've taken this even further in sort of a and this gets really out of the medical realm, for as terms of my thinking, that these crises that we're undergoing now on all aspects of society are really a consequence of not having paid attention to the networks and the interconnectedness of everything, in terms of how we eat and how we live with the climate. Like, I mean, all these things it's not coincidence that this crisis is happening at all levels at the same time now.
Yeah.
And it's almost, I mean, this becomes almost like an Eastern philosophical concept that this connected system on the planet it must represent some form of consciousness. We can't really tap into this unless somebody's is a deep meditator, but and that this consciousness is now in changing. It's responding to this crisis, and I think I like to look at this in an optimistic way.
Yeah.
That the consciousness will change. We're seeing the first indications in science. We're seeing it. We've always also see this in increasing clarity that women are pushing this change in consciousness, because this reductionistic, purely rational, purely linear approach to reality is clearly a function of the male brain, and
right.
I think what we're seeing now is we're going into a pretty deep hole. I think there's no question about it. We will have more pandemics. We will have dramatic climate changes, but I see it optimistically. I think at the end of this, we'll come out of this in at a higher level of consciousness, which is now evolving. So not a very medical thought, but I can help, sort of seeing that when I look at it, all the things going on right now in different areas of the world and in our thinking.
Yeah, and what you said lines up a lot with what I've learned from people like Ken Wilber and Don Beck in terms of understanding humans' evolutionary development. Is like the pendulum often has to swing really far to the extreme before we understand at a level of enough people tipping point of like, oh, that doesn't work, and then
exactly
and then it goes to an opposite, right? It goes to a holism of that opposite, and I just want to confirm, like, just for people, it's like if you're listening in, it's like women's bodies are cyclical, right? And that's why it's easier for us to understand in the holisms, and we can also see, not just from Eastern thought, Eastern religion, Eastern medicine, but also like really any indigenous culture has any intact indigenous culture has a holistic concern and care. So it's not just growth for this generation, it's growth for future generations, right? And even right now, if we just want to round the conversation out and bring it back to the beginning, like we know how the newborn passes through the vaginal canal, picking up the microbiome, right? We were able to pass microbiome on. Like we're literally passing it on to future generations, just in the simple process of regenerating our genes, right, into the next generation. So it's such a beautiful, I think, analogy and way to tap in. Thank you so much for your time. It's just been, I'm gonna read your book. I'm gonna send you Wild Habits, and I'd love for you, especially in the sections where I'm on the immune system and microbiome, if I've got anything wrong, I would love for you to let me know.
I can't wait to read it.
I can't wait for you to read it. And I can't wait to hear about what you think about the whole urine therapy microbiome connection. That community, those user groups are just, they're just really growing. And there's someone in Malibu I'll connect you with. I know that's not right around the corner, but it's not too far away.
No, it's only 15 minutes away from us here. So we live in in Topanga Canyon. So, you
Oh,
know,
beautiful. Oh, I love Topanga.
very close. Yeah, no, please do. I would really be curious. This is something, as I said in the beginning, I'm not familiar with. There's only one thing that I sort of comes to mind, that, you know, when we did these studies on early life adversity with rats and rat pups, and how mothers lick the urogenital part of the newborns, and that is a stimulus for the normal development of the urogenital system. And at the same time, it provides the moms with a major part of their fluid needs for days. So the urine from their pups. I've always found that fascinating.
I can't wait to read that study. Yeah. Well, I mean, and this is part of it, right? Is like, that's what the urine therapy user groups are adamant about, is depth of hydration. And it's the replenishment of the electrolytes. It's the feeding of the microbiome. It's the release of nitric oxide from endogenous microbiome that the urine seems to stimulate. It's like, there's so many intricate cycles within it. So yeah, we need more people like you knowing a little bit about what's going on over there. Thank you so much for your research. Thank you so much for your time. And I'm gonna read your book and see if I can get you back on the show.
Okay, thanks for having me on the show. I really enjoyed it. Really fascinating discussion.